Wixoss isn't a particularly unconventional trading card game. Many of the concepts, like leveling up, accumulating resources, playing creatures, attacking, and inflicting damage to progress towards victory, are pretty familiar concepts to just about anyone who has picked up a TCG in the past. However, applying these familiar trading card game concepts to Wixoss's gameplay is not always straightforward, and it can be a bit of a challenge to adapt for someone who is used to the pace and tempo of another trading card game. So for this video series, I wanted to break down a few of the core concepts and explore what they mean for deck building and gameplay in Wixoss. To start with, I'm going to focus a bit on what aggression looks like. The basic idea of aggressive strategies, or aggro decks, is the same in pretty much every game. You are trying to win before you lose, and Wixoss is no different. In Wixoss, red is the most aggressive color, followed by black. What's somewhat different in Wixoss is that every deck is going to have some aggressive elements. The Lyrig attack gives all decks a constant source of pressure throughout the game. So, to see what separates an aggro-focused deck from a deck that merely has aggressive elements, consider the following mono-red no-limit list focused on Hirana as the center Lyrig. While I can't claim that this is necessarily the most polished deck list out there, going over it is going to show a lot of the common cards and features of an aggro deck in Wixoss, and should give you a good foundation when you're trying to build your own aggro deck. The first main element of this deck is its removal. The second main element of this deck is also removal. And the third main element is yet more removal. Removal is the main tool to push damage in Wixoss, and aggro decks look to push damage at all stages of the game. As such, a huge amount of space within the deck needs to be devoted to removal. Much of this removal is very limited in scope. Romail only hits Signy with 3000 or less power, and Lancelot at level 2 only has a slightly wider range at 5000 or less power. And yet these are staples of most aggressive decks out there, and indeed, this deck even has multiple copies of these same effects, in Zapar at level 1 and Hera at level 2. These effects will often fail to find any targets at all once the opponent hits level 3 and is able to start fielding a more powerful board. But being able to open lanes at level 1 and 2 is hugely important to be able to hit the ground running and gain an early damage lead over the opponent. Cards like Roaring Inferno and Akino Rock give the deck ways to open lanes from level 1 straight through to the later stages of the game, while its level 3 Signy lineup are focused on clearing lanes to attack through the more powerful boards that players are going to be able to set up at level 3 and keep the damage going all the way through to the end. Crucially, all of these effects have a very low enter cost, which allows the deck to use them to push damage turn after turn, without needing to take any breaks to rebuild your resources. If all of this removal isn't enough, the fourth element of this deck is extra damage. This principally comes from two main sources. There's your level 3's once per game ability, and the piece Glory Grow. This doesn't take up a whole lot of room in your deck, but it is very important. Once your opponent hits level 3, not only is their board going to be more difficult to poke holes through to attack, but they're also going to be able to start hitting you back a lot harder. These additional damage sources are there to keep you in the race until you can bring the game to an end. Finally, the last component of the deck is tools to disrupt the opponent and to boost your own consistency. These once again take up relatively little space. In this version it's just a few of the Lyrig deck slots, but they can throw the opponent off balance during crucial turns, especially early in the game, and they can generally limit their ability to stabilize or counterattack. Ray hits hard and fast on turn 1 and 2, disrupting the opponent's hand, and Go to the Top is often used in the final turn to cripple the opponent's ability to mount a defense by removing 3 of their enter. At the same time, these cards also boost your own consistency, helping you to make sure that you're not going to stumble in the early game, which can be fatal to this kind of deck because the early game is so important. Now, there are obviously a ton of different variations of aggressive decks to be built, from simply adding more colors to no limit lists, to trying to build an aggro deck out of Card Jockey, which is also a strong option, and there's also just plenty of room to refine this mono red list. If you want a more in-depth discussion of these kinds of decks regarding card choices and meta-analysis, I highly recommend the Life Burst podcast. They do a lot of testing, and they can back up their deck lists with real-world observations from their local game scenes. However, this introduction should give you a solid base regarding the common card inclusions and their role within the overall game plan and strategy of aggressive decks in Wixoss. For the next video, I'll be digging into very much the opposite of aggressive decks and looking at defensive decks. Until then, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.